Hey, hi everyone. I hope you all are doing good. So, in today's session, I'm going to cover the proxy design pattern belonging to the structural design patterns category. Okay, a proxy in its most general form is a class functioning as an interface to something else. Okay, so think of a proxy. Okay, like someone giving a proxy attendance for you. In college days, most of us would have done. Okay, our friend would have went outside for some personal commitment, and on his behalf we had given attendance for him. Okay, sometimes we got caught also. That's a different case. Okay, so the proxy could interface to anything. It may be a network connection, a large object in a memory, a file, a wcf service, or any other resource that is expensive or impossible to duplicate. In short, a proxy is a wrapper or agent object that is being called by the client to access the real serving object behind the scenes. Okay, use of the proxy can simply be forwarding to the real object or can provide additional logic. Okay, in the proxy, extra functionality can be provided. For example, caching when operations on the real objects are resource intensive. Proxy can add additional logic of checking preconditions before operations on the real objects are invoked. Okay, for example, you are trying to access a sensitive file or a document, so before accessing that file you can put some additional validations or permission checks on your proxy object so that all those checks are satisfied before accessing that or forwarding that request to get that document. Okay, for the client, usage of a proxy object is like using the real object because both implement the same interface. Yes. So if you would have used the Windows Communication Services, WCF, the Windows Communication Foundation Services in .NET. Okay, so basically what we do using the WSDL, the WSDL file, we basically construct a proxy on our client application. So if you see the proxy object, there is no difference between the real object and the proxy object because both implement the same interface. Both provide the same service endpoint signatures. Okay, and it's basically same. It's same like accessing your real object. Okay, so another example is giving checks to your yeah customers basically. Okay, so in most of the cases, for example, if you want to do funding for any of your customer or your friends, what you do, you will give a check. Okay, and check represents your proxy of your funding, but when you submit that check to bank, actual funding will be happen from your account from the bank side. Okay, so your funds from the bank are the actual real object, whereas your check is a proxy. So what problems can the proxy design pattern solve? Okay, okay, the access to an object should be controlled. Okay, the access to the real object should be controlled. And then second one is additional functionality should be provided when accessing an object. Okay, when accessing sensitive objects, for example, it should be possible to check that clients have the needed access rights. Okay, so that's what this particular design pattern, this is the problem, that's what this particular design pattern solves. Okay, well, what solution does the proxy design pattern describe? Okay, define a separate proxy object that can be used as a substitute for another object or the subject. Okay, the actual object implements additional functionality to control the access to this object. Okay, you will provide the additional functionality like checking whether a particular user has a permissions or not to access the real object. It may be a underlying WCF service, a web API, a document, whatever it may be. Okay, so this makes it possible to work through a proxy object to perform additional functionality when accessing an object. For example, to check the access rights of a client accessing a sensitive object. That's one example, basically, which I already explained. To act as a substitute for a subject. Okay, to act as a substitute for a subject or a real service provider, a proxy must implement the subject interface. Okay, clients can't tell whether they are working with a subject or its proxy because both implements the same subject interface. Okay, it's a kind of subject contract you can call, which provides a set of functionalities. Okay, so the UML class diagram, pretty simple. Your client basically what it does, it will try to access your real object by using this subject interface. Your client will never contain a concrete object, basically, sorry, the concrete class of this real object in its program to construct it. Okay, what it does is basically it simply puts a request to your subject. Okay, right. So if you see the UML class diagram, this is my subject interface, and two classes basically implementing that subject interface proxy, okay, as well as real subject. Okay, so what happens when proxy calls the do action method? It is basically holding a reference or a pointer to your real object. Okay, so it simply calls that real object dot do action on your real object. Okay, so whatever object reference or a pointer it contains to real object, right, on that it simply forwards that call to your real object. Okay, so that is the UML class diagram, pretty simple guys. Okay, so your client will be dealing with this proxy object. Okay, it will construct an instance of a proxy object, okay, using this interface itself, and then performs the do action. Okay, and then the proxy will takes the responsibility of forwarding it to the real object behind the scenes. Three types of proxies are available. Remote proxy in distributed object communication. A local object represents a remote object, one that belongs to a different address space basically. So if you people are aware of remote procedure calls, okay, RPCs in earlier days and WCF services and all, right? So basically this is a good example. The local object is a proxy for the remote object, and a method invocation on the local object results in a remote method invocation on the remote object. An example would be an ATM implementation where the ATM might hold proxy objects for bank information services that exist on the remote server. Virtual proxy. In place of a complex or heavy object, a skeleton representation may be advantageous in some cases. Okay, when an underlying image is huge in size, it may be represented using a virtual proxy object, loading the real object on demand. Okay, I'm going to explain this in detail in my next video. Production proxy. A production proxy might be used to control access to a resource based on the access rights. Okay, so let's go through a simple demo now. Okay, so I have taken a trivial example basically. Okay, I found this particular example on internet. I think very trivial and very easy to demonstrate. So thank you for the contributor of such simple example. So public class employee. Employee is particularly a user, okay, who wants to access some resources. Okay, and I shared folder. This is basically a, resource. Okay, a expensive resource which I want to access. Okay, and then this is the contract basically. If you see my UML diagram, yeah, this is the subject interface which gives this functionality basically. Okay, some functionality. Okay, so you can see that over here I shared folder, and it gives a functionality of perform read write operations. Okay, so this is the contract subject interface. Now the actual object, okay, the behind the scenes whatever actual object we access through the proxy, right, this is the one. So shared folder which implements this I shared folder interface, and provides a implementation for perform read write operations. Okay, this is the class which actually performs the read write operations. Okay, so now comes how to construct a proxy object. Guys, please concentrate over here. Okay, so we have created a class shared folder proxy, which again implements the same contract, the subject interface I shared folder. Okay, and also holds a reference to I shared folder reference variable, or you can say a pointer. Okay, so private I shared folder, and then private employee, the employee object. Now constructor, through constructor we receive the employee. Okay, and then we assign the same employee instance to our class instance, or the instance variable employee. Okay, then public void perform operations. So in the perform operations of the proxy, just have a look what we are doing. So we are doing some additional checks. If employee dot role is equal to CEO, or if it is equal to manager, then only we are actually constructing that resource intensive operation or the object shared folder. Okay, folder equal to new shared folder, and then we are performing the actual operation. So your proxy, when it's a perform read write operations, okay, when the proxies perform read write operations is called, it basically delegates the same request to real subject or the real object. So in this case The real object is shared folder. So folder dot perform read write operations. Okay. If the user's role is not CEO, not manager, then we will end up in returning a message or printing a message that shared folder proxy says you don't have permission to access this folder. So I think you people would have understood the notion of proxy design pattern now. Okay, so if I run this program, I have two users, one with a role developer and one with a role manager. So it should allow access to manager, but it should prohibit access to developer. So if I run it, so I can very easily see that developer, okay, client passing employee with role developer to folder proxy. See, shared folder proxy says you don't have permission to access this because as per our access control we have implemented in our proxy, it won't allow any developer to access this folder. Okay, and again, for the manager it will allow to access the operations. So shared folder proxy makes call to real folder perform read write operations method. Okay, very simple. I hope you people understood the notion of this pattern. Okay, so if you find any scenarios where you can basically implement this particular design pattern, then feel free to implement it. Okay, so one of the main notion of this design pattern is the access to an object should be controlled. Okay, you are controlling access to an object which is very expensive to create. Okay, and you would want to add some additional functionality in order to access that object. Okay, so that's all about the proxy design pattern, guys. So I hope you people understood this concept. Thank you for listening and have a nice day.